Welcome, everyone, to this subscriber-only event from The Economist, yet another in our fantastic season of events for our subscribers. Today, I'm going to be talking with Sarah Maslin, our São Paulo bureau chief. I'm Helen Joyce, I'm the Britain editor and a former Brazil correspondent myself. So Sarah wrote a special report on the country that appeared on June 5th. And for anyone who cares about the country as I do, I was there in Brazil between 2010 and 2013, the report was quite shocking. The title was Brazil on the Brink. And the cover image that our great designers made for it showed the famous statue of Christ the Redeemer that overlooks Rio. And we've often used this image for covers before. This time we gave the Cristo the oxygen mask and a tank by it. And that symbolized several things. It symbolized the dire state of the rainforest, Brazil's politics, Brazil's economy, and of course the dire response to the COVID pandemic, which seems to have seen Brazil handle it pretty much worse than anywhere else. We're going to be talking about all this and more, plus Sarah's travels for her special report in the next 45 minutes. So why don't you start with a sort of a elevator pitch version, Brazil on the brink. What were you saying?
So in this special report, I wanted to really explain what's going on in Brazil now, but also how we got here. I got to Brazil exactly 3 years ago, and the first big coverage I did was of the campaign of Jair Bolsonaro and his election. And of course, I've already spent a lot of time thinking about, why he won and what that said about Brazil. But in this report, I really wanted to kind of go back even further. And so we gave it the tagline on the cover, the dismal decade. And in the special report, we say that, Bolsonaro and this COVID pandemic are really just the latest in a whole decade of disasters. And so the report really tries to understand through reporting in a bunch of different places in Brazil, including the northeastern state of Bahia, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, where I live, and parts of the Amazon, including indigenous territories, how these various factors and traumas that Brazil has suffered in the past decade came to be, and what they mean for Brazil's present and its future. And so the kind of things I focused on were, of course, the economy, which seemed to be really taking off in the early 2000s with a commodity boom, but now has been stagnant after a terrible recession a few years back. The political situation, and sort of tied to that, corruption, which really kind of shocked the country with the Lava Jato scandal a few years ago. And there was hope that that would be the beginning of a kind of a cleanup in politics, but instead the country has started to sort of backslide. And then the environment in the Amazon, and explaining kind of how the deforestation we're seeing today is in part to do with this government, but also to do with the lack of economic alternatives, and the fact that the Amazon's economy has really always been an extractive one. And so,
all those pieces idea together, yeah,
was to really put all these pieces together.
So we're going to want to drill into each of these separately, but why don't we start by looking at the reporting you did? And I think we have a map that we can put up so you can explain to our readers and our viewers where you were and what you were doing in each of those places. So I think, yes, there we go. All right, so why don't you tell us, where did you go first?
Okay, so the first place I went was a city called Camaçari, which is about an hour north of Salvador in Bahia, which is one of the states in Brazil's sort of impoverished northeast. And I was really keen to get a sense there of the hope of social mobility that Brazil lived through in the early 2000s, and then the kind of dampening of that hope and frustration of people. And this was a town where there was a Ford factory that had closed shortly before I got there. I went also to a nearby area where there were just tons of evangelical churches, and spent some time with evangelical Brazilians to understand sort of how that phenomenon is contributing to Brazil's reality. And then I went next to the Amazon, to the state of Rondônia, which is really kind of on what they call the sort of border of deforestation, or the arc of deforestation. Much of the area has already been converted to farmland, but you've also still got rainforest. And so this is really where attention is focused on needing to kind of keep the remaining rainforest. And I spent some time with an indigenous tribe that is sort of dealing with this crisis of seeing their forest chopped down, but also needing to, find a way for themselves to make a living that doesn't involve cutting down trees. And then I went to Rio de Janeiro, which, we put on the cover for a reason. Rio is really kind of emblematic of the rise and fall that Brazil has seen in the past decade. A decade ago, it was really kind of flush with oil money. There were all these programs to try to make the favelas safer, and now, 10 years later, it's become really a symbol of the corruption scandal and the kind of increase in crime and deterioration of public services that have come as a result of the corruption and the recession, but also really the political system's failure to be able to deal with these problems. And I didn't get a chance to go to Brasilia. It was really kind of shut down because of COVID. And so I was hoping to get into Congress, and that didn't happen. But I was able to do some Zoom meetings with some of the congressmen and into some congressional sessions to try to get a sense of whether there is any hope or seeds of kind of renewal and change within Congress. And so that was sort of the second to last bit. And then I came back to Sao Paulo just in time for a big demonstration of Bolsonaro supporters who at that point were upset that the government is being investigated for its handling of the pandemic by Congress. And these supporters went out and declared their support and, asked actually for the army to shut down the Supreme Court and shut down Congress and give Bolsonaro total power, which is also pretty shocking if you've seen and lived through Brazil. I don't know whether that's something that even would have entered your head when you were a correspondent there.
No, it's so interesting to see where you went and to think about the last time that I did a big reporting trip in Brazil, which was also for a special report. And we said that Brazil was grounded. We also used the Cristo statue for that cover. And this time, the Cristo was just kind of looking like he wasn't going anywhere. I think you can chart the history of Brazil. Brazil takes off in 2009. The Christ had his rockets, and then it was grounded. And then I think we've used him spiraling into the bay, the Guanabara Bay outside Rio. And now we have on life support. It's actually extremely depressing. But yeah, so I was writing in 2013. It was coming up to the Olympics and the World Cup, obviously. In reverse order. And I went to Rio and I flew over the city to look at the building work that was happening. And yes, I was very aware. And I went to Manaus as well. I was very aware that the things they were building, in particular, the large football stadiums, were not justified, and that there was a great deal of corruption involved in that, which we will return to. But still, it felt hopeful. It felt like Brazil was on the map. I think when I was leaving, sort of towards the end of 2013, was when they were starting to protest about bus fares, which didn't seem to be something that would really take so seriously that it would bring down a whole country, but it did. And then Jair Bolsonaro, I only heard of him as this blowhard congressman who liked telling people that they deserve to be raped, or that their sons should be gay, or something like this. Very unpleasant man, and not a serious player at all. He came out of nowhere.
Yeah. No, totally. And it's interesting to hear you kind of talk about that sense of hope. It's really foreign to me. I showed up when the country already felt like it was sort of in a ditch, and then Bolsonaro came, and there was some hope among some people that he would, despite all of these problems that you mentioned, that he would at least be able to kind of get the economy back on track. And we'll talk about that later as well. But really, he's made everything worse. And so, of course, another big part of this reporting I was doing is trying to kind of explain how he's taken, as we said in one of the stories, a patient that was already ill and put it in a coma.
So why don't we start we'll start with the Amazon because we've just had that picture in our mind of you going to Sete de Setembro, I think the Indigenous Reserve. And actually, one of the questions that came in from one of our readers is a particularly good one, which is that it's 1992 that the world leaders met in Rio, so very nearly 30 years ago, and talked about the environment and saving, in particular, the Amazonian rainforest. And people actually seemed to get it then, nearly 30 years ago. What happened? Is it just Bolsonaro? Is it just that he's not the sort of person who cares about rainforests, or is it much more than that?
Yeah, and so part of the reason that I ended up focusing on this on kind of illegal gold mining and diamond mining, and on the lack of sort of economic alternatives to extractive activities, which include, of course, logging and farming and mining and all of these things that could be okay in small and controlled doses, but are really sort of plundering the forest. Part of the reason I went and decided to focus on this is because oftentimes, there's attention that's really deserved on the way that this government has kind of dismantled the environment ministry and sent sort of messages to people who are illegally deforesting that's fine with them and they're not going to get in trouble. And that has, made the situation much worse. I think we have a graph that shows deforestation and it has jumped under Bolsonaro. But it's also been going up, since around 2012, since the economy started slowing down. And, part of the problem is that ever since that Rio conference in 1992, there's been this talk about basically a bioeconomy or finding a way to convert the standing forest into economic income for people living in the Amazon. And there are lots of really good ideas, and research has kind of started translating some of those ideas into projects and plans, but it's never really taken off. This bioeconomy is still very much, on paper and in papers, and not really reality. And so I wanted to kind of understand why that is and what the consequences were. And I had sort of a perfect way to do it. I was really pleased to get to go visit the territory of a tribe called the Paiter Surui, who were first contacted in 1968, or 1969, which is really not that long ago. The sort of elder leaders of this indigenous group remember being kids at the time that they first started seeing lots of farmers arriving and cutting down the forest. And at that time, farmers were invited by the government to sort of colonize what they called a demographic void, as if there weren't sort of people already living there. And now, fast forward 40 or 50 years, and there are two cousins who are both caciques or leaders on this vast indigenous reservation in Rondônia. And one of them is trying very hard to devote his village to sort of economically sustainable activity or environmentally sustainable activities like growing coffee and Brazil nuts, and trying to scale all of that up and have partnerships with companies that can help them sell it. And then the other cousin has been actually expulsed from his original village and has a different village in a different part of the territory, and over the years has gotten involved with loggers and with illegal diamond miners. And the reason, he says, is that the forest is going to get cut down anyway, and we need a way to make a living. And at the very least, we should be benefiting from this sort of pillaging that's going on. But unfortunately, he's even kind of become disillusioned with his involvement with mining as well, because even though the miners promised to give him a certain percentage, at the end of the day, often they end up cheating him, and his village is suffering as well. And so the story is really about not just the way that Bolsonaro's government has kind of made everything worse in the environment, but how it's also the failure of the international community that met in Rio and Brazil's government. And over the years, lots of people who need to really work more on this kind of aspect of what is going to replace these deforestation heavy activities.
So it sounds like it's a question, I mean, this isn't going to surprise anybody, but of sort of institutional capacity. And that really brings me on to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is, I mean, that's the slow burn disaster, but the immediate, extraordinary disaster that's sweeping across Brazil is possibly the world's most incompetent response to COVID. What happened there? I mean, that's not Jair Bolsonaro thinking, great, let's cut the forest down. That's what I always wanted to do. I mean, he doesn't actually want people to die. So how come such incompetence?
Well, I think on this one, you can place the blame more squarely on Bolsonaro, perhaps. In this case, Brazil actually has historically done a pretty good job of turning its public health system toward vaccinating people and preventing epidemics from getting worse, like with Zika and other epidemics in the past. In this case, he sort of followed in Trump's footsteps early on and said that COVID wasn't anything to worry about. I don't need to kind of get into all the details. People are probably pretty familiar with it. But I think, maybe the difference is that while a lot of world leaders brushed this thing off a year ago and took a while to kind of get their heads in the game on what needed to be done, Bolsonaro, they eventually did. They eventually, Trump himself was kind of trumpeting hydroxychloroquine, but then he made sure to get lots of vaccine orders. Bolsonaro has really stuck to his COVID denialism the whole way through. And Brazilians sort of took a while to understand the impact of that, partly because the government actually did a good job with the economic stimulus last year. They gave people, around a third of Brazilians, really generous benefits. But with the fiscal situation the way it is, and we'll talk about that later too, they couldn't keep that going. And so they were hit and sort of slammed with a new variant at the beginning of this year. Things were opening up again. And there was no longer sort of money to soften the economic blow. And Bolsonaro, I guess most importantly, ignored emails from Pfizer and offers from other manufacturers of vaccines for months and months, thinking that I guess that perhaps that he doesn't believe in them, or maybe because he'd sort of already committed so much to this hydroxychloroquine strategy and didn't want to sort of admit that the scientific way is the right way. He ended up doing this really long delay, which when the second wave hit this year was catastrophic. So, at this point, it's the country's sort of still stuck in this this sort of cycle, and it's really quite depressing.
I mean, I'm puzzled that the prospect of an election in 2022 isn't concentrating this man's mind. I mean, it's one thing early in a presidential cycle to be saying wild things about how getting vaccinated, turns you into a crocodile or whatever one of his more notorious statements was. But if he doesn't get the economy going again and people vaccinated and people back out and stopping dying, 2022 is going to be a bloodbath for him, no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, if there's one thing we've learned about Bolsonaro, it's that he's extremely resilient. And a lot of us were really surprised last year when kind of coming out of the first wave, which was really awful in Brazil, Bolsonaro's approval ratings actually went up. And that was to do with this economic aid called Auxílio Emergencial that he was paying to people. And so I think now, he is kind of, he's toned it down on the anti-vaccine rhetoric. He himself has not gotten vaccinated, but he's starting to now say that we're going to vaccinate all Brazilians by such and such date and brag about the deal that they finally made with Pfizer. And so he has kind of toned down on that respect. And then he's really hoping that the economy will pick back up. And it's sort of a razor thin margin that he's walking on. But what he's hoping is that the economy will pick up, the pandemic will be controlled enough with vaccination, and then by the time 2022 rolls along, things will sort of start to feel better. And his rival, may be Lula, the president from the left-wing Workers' Party, who has pretty high rejection ratings as well. So
let's return to politics.
Yeah.
Let's return to politics and let's talk about economics first then. So Give us a quick recap of what's happened since the beginning of the pandemic. As you say, there was this large and pretty well organised fiscal stimulus done through the emergency aid. What happened? What else happened? I mean, that will have kept anybody's approval ratings up.
So Bolsonaro kind of came in after having been a pretty statist congressman for a number of decades. He hired a liberal economy minister, Paulo Guedes, and they promised to do all sorts of sort of business-friendly reforms. And his first year in government, they did push past a pensions reform that, had really it was very needed and hadn't been possible under previous governments for all sorts of reasons. But then since that, he's kind of abandoned these other reforms. Brazil really needs a big public sector reform to stop the kind of uncontrolled growth of spending on public servants who, there are things like automatic pay raises. There's even something called a post-mortem promotion, whereas someone gets sort of a pay raise once they've died, and that's passed on then to their survivors' pensions. And so that kind of thing needs to be reformed, not only for the economic situation, but also to make public services kind of more efficient and effective for people. And that kind of links to the other main problem in Brazil, which is that its productivity has been lagging for years and years, and it's a really tough place to have businesses, and so part of the reason why the kind of economy hasn't jumped back after the recession is because of these sort of structural problems. So you can see here the way that that the economy was sort of growing and then really tanked, and then was sort of stagnant for a few years, and then has gotten stuck again with the pandemic. And really what it needs is tax reform, more privatizations, basically a big confidence boost that would convince investors, not just sort of in the stock market, which is actually doing pretty well, but also people to sort of invest in infrastructure and in the kind of projects and companies that would provide jobs.
That middle chart is the killer, isn't it? Because unemployment rates high unemployment rates kill Brazilian incumbents.
And that's exactly what I was about to mention. So we, there's been a kind of excitement because the Q1 numbers this year were much better than people expected. There was even talk a few months ago of perhaps there being a recession, but actually, the economy grew quite a lot in the first quarter, despite the fact that was a time when the pandemic was getting worse. And the reason is that Brazil didn't shut down the way it really should have for public health reasons, but that kind of growth hasn't really trickled down to solve the employment. Employment is a record, I think 14.7% or so right now. And so, really the question going forward is can they do some of these reforms in time to give the economy this confidence boost that could translate into more people having a better chance of getting jobs, or even in providing some more social spending, emergency aid to people who are suffering from poverty, which is, except for last year, has actually been kind of cut back in recent years.
So we have an interesting question, I think, before we go on to the political question, which is, it's kind of related. George says, who in Brazil supports Bolsonaro and why do they support him and how strong is this support? So you did a lot of reporting, you talked to a lot of people, I presume to plenty of Bolsonaristas. What is it? What do they like about this man?
Well, it's a bunch of different groups, and I mean, one thing that's interesting is kind of how his support has shifted and changed slightly. But when he was elected, he had this kind of core group of 20 to 30% maybe of people who really believed in him and were frustrated not only at the kind of corruption in previous governments, including the Workers' Party, which was in before, but also were frustrated at the kind of social progress that was being had, and thought that Brazil should, become more conservative again. And so in that group, you've got kind of evangelicals, um, and that has been one of his strongest groups, and one that I spent a lot of time with for this report. But then you also, had business people who were worried about another PT government and thought that Paulo Guedes maybe could do a shake-up with the economy. And then you had, Brazilians of kind of all walks of life who were really sick of the PT. And I think one thing that's really interesting to me, I'm American, and whereas in the U.S. the split between Democrat and Republican is very regional, and if you live in a place that in a town that's really, democratic, you might not even come into contact in the street with people who had voted for Trump, and families. It's kind of rare to have families split over politics. In Brazil, it's totally the opposite. You have tons of families where half of the family voted for Bolsonaro and half voted for the PT, and so while there are kind of regional differences, you also really have on an individual level this frustration with what has come before him. And so now, I guess, the question is now, how much of that support has he kept and how much has he lost? And the most recent polls show him losing support, including from evangelicals and from the sort of higher income groups that supported him before. But on the other hand, he's got some tools in his toolbox yet, and we saw last year how he kind of gained support among poor people through these emergency payments. So he could try that again, and it really depends on who his rival's going to be.
So before we start to talk in detail about the 2022 election, I have another question that I thought was a really rather good one. Let me see where it was. So one of our viewers wants to know if you had to say how confident or otherwise you were that Brazil would actually pull it out of the bag, because people are always predicting disaster for Brazil. Mm-hmm. They're also predicting wonderful things for Brazil. Where do you come down on that? What's your balance between really just keeping going down this wrong path and maybe righting it?
Wow, that's a really tough question. I'd like to be an optimist, and so I do think that things are going to get better than they are now. I think that there's a good chance that Bolsonaro will be voted out. Then there's a kind of another complicated series of questions about whether he would accept a loss if indeed he loses. But I also think, one thing that a friend and source of mine told me when we sat down for lunch and talked about this report before I head off on my reporting is that Brazil is sort of a history of big ups and big downs, and the ups are sort of really high and the downs are also really low. And so I think Brazil probably will come back, but the risk is that it sort of comes back and then heads down again. And that's really, you're not going to win an election talking about structural reform, and so that's not really what we're going to be hearing during the campaign. But it is really important. And I guess
well, let's talk about that campaign then.
Yeah, we should talk about the campaign, and then I guess maybe we should talk about the kind of corruption, because that's the final thing that maybe we should talk about corruption first. That's sort of perhaps the main reason why Bolsonaro won in 2018 is that people had known that corruption existed, for years, but the scale and impunity under which it existed was exposed with the Lava Jato investigations and really angered people. People were really, really
just
mad.
Remind us.
Remind
us of Lava Jato.
Lava Jato was an investigation that was opened in 2014 into sort of a scheme of bribes from construction companies and other businesses to the government, which were then kind of returned in contracts with Petrobras, the state oil company, and then a lot of the money ended up going to, being split between these 30 or so political parties that the government needed to have support in Congress, and went into political campaigns and pork projects and all sorts of things like that. But the way that the sort of investigation unfolded and really showed just how deep this corruption was and how many different politicians were involved. I think at the end of the day, 95 politicians were charged, and many, many more were kind of mentioned and weren't ever charged. That drove people into the streets, and those protests that you talked about in 2013 over bus fares sort of morphed into protests that against this corruption, and ultimately the protests really contributed to Dilma Rousseff from the PT getting impeached, which was a quite polarizing and traumatic process too. And so Bolsonaro comes in and he says, I was a congressman, but I'm really not like the rest of the politicians. I'm not going to use this sort of corrupt scheme of patronage and pork to do politics. And actually, I'm going to bring in as my justice minister the judge from Lava Jato, Sergio Moro, who was a real hero. And so that was sort of the rhetoric. And he promised that they do all sorts of reforms to make corruption easier to spot and to tackle. But it very quickly kind of fell apart because right at the beginning of his government, one of his sons was investigated, or is being investigated still, for money laundering in connected to his time as a state deputy in Rio, which is sort of notorious for the way that the kind of local politicians sort of have a scheme to siphon off some of their assistants' salaries. And so, Bolsonaro kind of dropped the anti-corruption fight because he was worried, about how it might impact his sons, all of whom, of course, deny everything they've been accused of. But at this point, he's got other sons now being investigated as well. And that Justice Minister, Sergio Moro, ended up quitting because Bolsonaro at one point fired the head of the federal police, which was investigating his sons. And so, you've seen a kind of a backlash against the anti-corruption drive. And part of that's also the fault of Lava Jato. We sort of learned over the years that the investigation wasn't objective either. We've learned that Sergio Moro was kind of coaching prosecutors in a way that seemed to be supporting the campaign of Bolsonaro during the election to the detriment of the PT. So all of these factors have kind of come together to derail this anti-corruption energy that was, at least there for a little while. And the thing that's really, this is the last thing that's really scary, and that I kind of tried to link in my story is that the risk is the kind of overall anti-establishmentism and people sort of just throwing their hands up and saying, the politicians aren't solving the problem, the police aren't solving the problem. And in a lot of places, especially in Rio, control has sort of morphed into these paramilitary groups that are, have become the law of the land. And that's really scary.
Yeah, one of our audience members, Timothy, has a very good way of putting the way that the next election is going to go. It's likely that Lula, who was president rather successfully, although there was a great deal of corruption then too in the 2000s, is going to be facing off against Bolsonaro. And of course, the rejection rates are both extremely high. So what you've got is a lot of people who really dislike Bolsonaro, a lot of people who really dislike Lula, a lot of people who really dislike both of them. And ideally, some third candidate could come along. Is that at all likely, or are we just going to look at one of these horrendous campaigns where everyone hates both the candidates?
So there are definitely going to be other candidates. The issue is that we'll have a repeat of what happened in 2018, which was that they kind of split the vote among them. So you've got the PSDB, which is the sort of centrist party that was for a very long time the main rival to the PT, and they're kind of looking at a number of candidates, including the governor of Sao Paulo. You've got more sort of left-wing people like Ciro Gomes, who is a very successful governor of Ceará, who's run a bunch of times. And then a few kind of people who are outsiders to politics, including a television presenter who's very popular. But at the end of the day, these people would all have to kind of agree to, come together and launch a single candidate, which seems pretty unlikely. right now, at least, it seems like probably what's going to happen is it is going to be Lula and Bolsonaro. And most recent polls show that Lula might actually win, which is a real change and shows just how upset people are about the pandemic. But there's also quite a lot of time for Bolsonaro to recover.
Sure. So Andrew says, will Jair Bolsonaro accept that result?
Yeah, we were all watching in January with the event, the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol in Brazil. We were all watching really closely because, there's been a lot of questioning by Bolsonaro of the electoral system. He suggested that the fact that they have electronic voting means that the system's more kind of subject to fraud. He's also, one thing we've only mentioned very briefly is that he's sort of stacked his government with military officials. He himself was an army captain, although he didn't ever get very far, but put a lot of generals into his cabinet and into government positions sort of throughout the government. And recently he's been sort of saying things like he could send the army to reopen businesses or send the army to close the Supreme Court, which he's never kind of come right out and said, but a lot of his supporters have kind of asked him to do, and he calls it my army. And so I think there is a real question about if he did lose, would he claim that he'd actually won and call his supporters into the streets? And if that happened, what would the police and the army do? I think we're all, hoping that they defend democracy, but there is more of a question in Brazil, partly because democracy is so young. I mean, the military dictatorship really wasn't that long ago. And so, you actually have seen that the defense minister was fired a few months ago, and then the kind of commanders of all of the forces resigned in protest. And that was interpreted as sort of a sign that they were not willing to just go along with Bolsonaro, whichever way he pleased. But we don't know really about if kind of things got really chaotic, how the army would respond.
Yeah, it seems a bit early to be trying to say how exactly the election will play out. But one thing I want to say, because a few people have asked, is PT stands for Partido dos Trabalhadores, Workers' Party. So that's Lula's party, and then Dilma's. I should have said that at the time. I mean, this is really a very dire sort of set of problems coming together. But we mustn't forget we're talking about 2022, and even a super, super incompetent response to the pandemic is not going to look the same next year as it does now. I mean, the sort of positive or hopeful version is, the pandemic comes somewhat under control, Brazil does vaccinate more people, the rest of the world starts to vaccinate, et cetera, opens up, things just kind of calm down a bit. And could that be enough to, return people to a somewhat more hopeful and less febrile environment?
I thought you were going to say, could that be enough for Bolsonaro to win? And I think that the answer to both those questions are yes. I think that even though he's really sort of suffered in the past few months with popularity, and also kind of in Congress, he's seeing his government sort of scrutinized. He also has a kind of a strong base that so far has ignored more than 100 impeachment petitions against him. And he has, the government at the end of the day, which is a lot of money that can be spent in all sorts of ways that will, win people's favor back. And so I think, things will kind of naturally calm down, hopefully, for the reasons you mentioned, with vaccination very slowly kind of progressing and the economy starting to pick up. And it seems sort of unlikely that they'll be able to do any really drastic structural reforms, but they could kind of get a slimmer version of a couple of them passed, which would perhaps boost confidence and the currency would improve, and other things with inflation would sort of calm down. And so I think I think that the reason that we're being so sort of calling attention to this decade of disasters and all these crises is taking a much more sort of zoomed back perspective. We're not saying that things, aren't going to get better in the next couple of years, but rather that if Brazil doesn't sort of admit what's gone wrong in the past decade and make a real plan for the next decade, that they're just going to be sort of stuck in this cycle of up and downs.
So one last question from a reader, which is from Alan, and an audience member, and he says, in my experience, Brazil projects a mixture of insecurity and national pride. How have the country's chattering classes responded to your special report? I think Alan really knows the country.
Yeah. It's hard to completely gauge because a lot of what you pick up is on social media, right? And of course, that's not everyone's on social media. But I was expecting more of a backlash when we published a cover in 2018 with Bolsonaro on the cover and a tagline that said something like Latin America's latest threat, and then we had a leader that went along with it saying that this guy was a threat to democracy. Not only did I have to leave Twitter because it was just such a flood of really violent messages from Bolsonaro supporters, which we've kind of gotten used to as journalists, but sometimes you just have to leave. But also, I got a lot of messages from sources who I trust, people who are economists or academics or businessmen or investors, saying, "I think you guys are kind of over exaggerating a little bit." Brazil's institutions are strong. He's not going to be that bad. It's going to be fine. And I think that this time, I was expecting from more of a backlash from Bolsonaro supporters, which luckily hasn't come so far, with the exception of the government, which published a sort of 23 tweet attack in response to our reporting. But I also haven't gotten as much of the sort of pushback from from the business community and from sort of Brazil experts in all walks of life. And I think, my interpretation is that people are worried. They're sort of they this guy has been quite a trial for Brazil in a lot of ways, and its institutions, we say, they have survived. The justice system, the Supreme Court, has kind of curbed him. Congress has managed to curb him, but they've also taken a real beating. The government bureaucracy is sort of now has all sorts of Bolsonaro supporters. The Environment Ministry is just one example of a ministry that's been kind of gutted, and every time that the sort of Supreme Court has to kind of knock him down, that then creates this sort of public perception that all of the powers are just sort of constantly against each other, which is really no good for kind of public confidence in these institutions. So, the reception has been really good. Actually, we've gotten a lot of great feedback, and I guess I'm really keen to hear what people think we've gotten right, and whether we've gotten some things wrong. But I would say that I think this time it was sort of people don't think we're exaggerating anymore when we say that this guy is a danger.
That's actually really bad news, Sarah, if you think about it. In 2018, people really felt that we were saying that it's worse than you thought, and now we're saying it's worse than that, and they're not saying it's worse than you thought. On the other hand, I also used to hear all the time between 2010 and 2013, from people who had really been around, people who had been there through the dictatorship, people who had seen all sorts like hyperinflation. They said, you always, not just us, everybody and the international press always exaggerate Brazil. You're always too optimistic or too pessimistic. So we can take away one of those two messages, and I'm not sure which. If you had to pick one, which would it be?
Well, and I take that criticism. I hope that we're going too far on this one. Of course, you also have the people who take the Economist covers as a sort of a contrarian index. So if we say Brazil's in a ditch, then I've seen a whole bunch of people saying, okay, time to go long on Brazil. And things, as I said, things probably will kind of pick up in the next few years. I really hope that they do. But that doesn't change sort of the fact that these underlying problems are there and have been kind of festering for many, many years. And Brazil needs to deal with them, and I want it to because I love it very much.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I always love thinking about Brazil. I always love talking to you, Sarah. But at the moment, I'm glad I'm not there. It's a shame, really. I really think it's a shame. And on that cheery note, thanks for watching. If you'd like to find out more about our upcoming subscriber events, please click below. On the same page, you'll find recordings of previous events, and that includes one on race in America and another on the future of education after the pandemic. See you next time.